disappointing. Okay. Anyway, welcome everybody. It's Wednesday evening. It's just gone 6:30, and it is Spin Legal with myself and Angela Browne from Invictus Legal LLP. We are partners of that firm. So, just to let you know, that's who we are. Hi, Angela.
Hi, Peter.
Right. So this week's topic of interest is federal law in Canada. What it's and how it impacts the people of Ontario, particularly. So last week we were looking at the three levels of laws in Canada: federal, provincial, and municipal, and we discussed more detail about municipal law. We'll come back next week with provincial law discussion. But today, this week, is about what is federal law and what is the impact that it has upon us as Ontarians.
Well, one of the things I always said, like when people talk about seriousness of issues, well, don't make a federal case out of this.
Yeah, but the trouble is that some of these cases, for example, if you're talking about traffic lights, the traffic light down the end of your street, you can make a federal case out of it, but it will never get heard by the federal, in the federal parliament, will it?
Never. The thing is, when you have it, we have what they call the division of powers by our BNA Act. When we had our constitution, that was set out. The federal government has responsibilities for certain things. The province has responsibility for certain things, and the province gives responsibilities to municipalities through its own legislation and its own power of appointment. Through the federal government, they have a whole broad scope of things. They deal with public debt and public financing. They regulate trade. They have employment insurance, taxation, Canada Post, defense, shipping, Canada Border Agency, what comes into Canada, what doesn't come into Canada, and what happens if you try to bring something into Canada that shouldn't be.
And also in that regard, international law as well. For example, when we make agreements with other sovereign nations or groups of sovereign nations, like the European Union, for example.
Trade agreements like CETA, like NAFTA, different things like that. Currency, the federal government determines what currency we use, what kind of money is valid to be used in the country. It's not like something that says, well, how come we can't use Bitcoin?
Yeah, I vote crypto. No, I don't.
Banking, they regulate the federal, the main banks, like your TD Canada Trust, your CIBC, the Royal Bank, National Bank. They regulate those banks. And the Bank of Canada.
But not credit unions.
No. Credit unions are considered more of a cooperative business, and they're under the provincial gambits. So basically, the Bank of Canada is appointed by the federal government, and it's an independent agency. People have lately think that somehow Trudeau has control over the Bank of Canada. He doesn't. Nor does Trudeau have any control over the Reserve Bank in the United States.
We'll get to those anyway. Other things is like patents and copyright, which are actually an international thing, believe it or not. They started the first patent and copyright international treaty was back in the 1840s, 1850s, I forget what. And most countries like Canada and UK, US agreed to them. There were probably only about 20 or 30 countries agreed to the original copyright, copyright treaty. But since they've developed over the years, and now we've got treaties which I think pretty well the whole world copies those treaties.
Because that's so that somebody tries to say that there's something created in the UK, and you can't go to Canada or some other country within that convention and infringe it. So
and that's an important.
Across borders.
Yeah, that applies across borders. So if you invent something in Japan, it's an international patent, and you infringe it in the United States, they can the Japanese company could, can sue you in the United States or anywhere else for that matter.
The only thing the individual countries have is how they register them. They have a registration system. But however, they're responsive internationally to the convention. Yeah.
The other couple of questions last remaining is indigenous, because there's been the various treaties that were signed with Canada in relation to the indigenous peoples of Canada. Criminal law, which we're all familiar with, and I have to say, I'm grateful that we have one criminal code across the country rather than 50 that exist in the United States. And
we have kind of a strange system with state rights in the States, which we don't have here.
Yeah. And the other one is, of course, prisons, right? This is prisons that are governed by the federal acts.
More than 2 years. 2 years or more.
Yeah, because there are still provincial prisons, and we'll talk about that next week.
Yeah. So there's just an interesting thing, and in federal laws, these are purely federal laws, and then there's other laws in the federal government. Hello, Robert. Yeah. So federal law, like some laws in that affect us, are hybrid. That they combine, that the provincial government has a piece of it, the federal government has a piece of it. For example, our court system, the federal government appoints for the Superior Court and the federal court system and the Supreme Court of Canada. And the province appoints the provincial courts.
Yep.
So these things, like they have a shared responsibility. Provincially, you have access, support, family law, separation agreements. They also govern common law relationships. But federally is divorce and marriage registration. Federally,
we'll come to that.
Property. So these things are, it's a very kind of a weird. That's why when we had the unification of the courts, that's why there was a benefit there, because you could deal with all of family law instead of just some parts of it and have to go somewhere else and deal with another part of it.
Okay. So first item on our list is public debt. The money spent on federal projects, the defense of the nation, the federal government has borrowing power.
Yep, they have borrowing power. And this is done where they need to build infrastructure somewhere. During the pandemic, they had to create a way to pay out some of the ways to protect us from the effects of the lockdowns and pandemic, so that they can get the vaccines created. So they had to pay somebody to do this stuff and on time. Okay, so it becomes something that it's not something that was in your plan. Like, I'm sure when they started the plan for the federal budget that they didn't plan for a pandemic to happen in 2020.
You can bet your bottom dollar they didn't. That's part of the,
and then when that happened, they said, okay, now we're in this situation, we have to do something. So they had to do something about getting the vaccines done, get some research done, helping implement any projects of public protection that they had to set up. So these things were all done. And then, of course, there were consequences to this. And like, we can agree or disagree as to whether the restrictions and the pandemic relief and all that stuff was a good thing or not a good thing. But the thing is, the fact is, it was done, and then we had to also help people deal with the consequences of it.
And just to be clear, legally, there is no way that if a government decides to spend $100 million on something, legally, there is no way you can challenge that, is there?
No. You can't take the government to court and say, you're spending my tax dollars.
all you can
do is vote another party the next election.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. All you can do is make sure this current government is gone when the next election comes.
If you feel that somebody's overspending, or if you feel they're not spending enough, or whatever, you have a right as a voter.
options, all of those options are only controlled by democracy, not through the courts.
Yeah, exactly. And these are things that, like particular, like even defense, like there's different things we have to decide as a country about whether we be getting involved in an international conflict or not, whether we provide some support.
Yeah.
Like currently we provide some support to Ukraine and we provide some support to train some militaries offshore.
And of course, for example, if you're going to build a new fleet of battleships or something, that would be part of the public debt that would come up in this category.
Yeah, and this is something happening because even during the World War I don't think they had a lot of taxation going around. At that time, it was through the Bank of Canada, and they created that, and then it eventually paid off with itself through the investment in infrastructure, and these things can pay themselves back. And then they invented the income tax. The income tax is actually set up to create incentives or to create disincentives. So that's how it kind of became over time. Okay, so now we have the carbon tax, which is people are saying, okay, we want to disincent people to stop using so much fossil fuels. Okay, and then we want to use some money so that we can encourage companies to do research to develop alternatives. So there's a lot of different ways. It depends on the goals and objectives of what you're trying to achieve. So the federal government would basically make these types of decisions. Okay, as a voter, you may say, "I don't want the carbon tax. I don't want the carbon tax." Okay, that's fine. I mean, we see enough protests out there. I mean, there's enough people protesting.
That's up to our individual voters.
Yeah, exactly.
Favor carbon tax on this hand or don't favor it on that hand. That's entirely up to the voters.
Yeah.
Okay.
And currency is also an interesting thing about how the Bank of Canada controls in terms of how money is created. Money is created simply by taking a loan. You go to your bank, use your Visa card, take out a loan.
Just print me a whole load of money. I can be rich.
Yeah. I can just go to the Bank of Canada. I want to borrow from the Bank of Canada.
Print me $20 million, eh?
Yeah.
But the trouble is with the course of that kind of stuff is that they have economic knock-ons, don't they?
Yeah, there's certain things you have to be really careful with. You can't be doing this too long and over time. And you have to be careful with the investments that go out. I mean, some of them could be inflationary if you do them for an extended period of time, and then like well beyond its usefulness. And there's different things. But Bank of Canada is an independent facility. It's an independent agency. The government appoints the governor of the Bank of Canada, and the governor has a very specific lifetime. So it's not like I don't like the governor of the Bank of Canada, so I'm going to fire him. You can't do that. Okay? They don't have the power to fire him. He has a term. It's like the ombudsman on Ontario. They have a term. So they can't get fired because they don't like their opinion. Okay? Yeah. Like there's a lot of things the Bank of Canada does that I don't like what they do. But the thing is, these things are responsive to economic environment and to try to encourage certain types of economic effects within a country. Like inflation was going sky high. People can't afford anything. We can't afford workers. We can't afford things. So they raise the interest rates. I mean, the effectiveness of doing that is questionable. But that's one of their methods they use.
And again, we go back to where we were in the very beginning. You don't like what the current government is doing, throw them out in the next election. And I'll say that, and I'm not being anti-Trudeau or anything like that. I would say that about Poilievre. I would say that about Harper. I would say that about any government that you've got. If you don't like what they're doing, kick them out.
Yeah. But I'm just reminding the listeners that the Bank of Canada is an independent party. Exactly. You can't be blaming Trudeau for the actions of the Bank of Canada.
Exactly that.
Yeah, they govern banking, the printing of currency, and basically what happens is it responds to various things. You're taking a loan, you're borrowing, and that creates money.
That basically is all about governing banking, is all about the rules and regulations that when you want a loan, the government has set what those rules are. They set up what the rules are for use of debit cards and credit cards and things like that.
That's all they do, is they set the rules, and the banks, the Bank of Canada, other economic institutions that are independent, they carry out and follow those rules. Right? And then they make their own decisions about what they're going to do with their business. So this is where people have to understand that our governments are really hands off in a lot of these things. Right? People think that, say, our prime minister has daily talks with the Bank of Canada or daily talks with all the banks or all of the. He doesn't. Like, these are things that are governed like very separately. They have to be independent.
Yeah, and our
currency has to be independent too, so that we can interact. Like when people come from other countries and we trade with other countries, and so that our currency and our trade balances out. So there's a trade balance, and there's and also too, there could be some work in terms of paying back the deficit. Okay, but I don't want to give an economics lesson here. But a lot of things aren't what people think it is. And
well, I was going to say there are, when it comes down to the governing of that, of course, there are parliamentary committees and there are parliamentary staff committees that deal with a lot of that kind of management as well, right? So then the other one that we can move on to is the management of benefits like EI, CPP, pensions, OAS, and the new disability benefit that they're discussing right now. All of that.
There's two types of CPP benefits out there. One is called CPPD, or disability, where if you were before retirement age and you become permanently or long-term disabled, or you're terminally ill, you can collect the CPPD. And the other one is CPP retirement, or CPPR, where you can apply at 65 or even earlier, maybe 60, to get a lower benefit. And you can collect that benefit. And that's for anybody who has paid into the system, and it pays you back accordingly to how much you paid into it. Okay. So there's various financial advice about how you can deal with your CPP benefit. Other countries in the Western world have their own. The United States has its Social Security. The UK has its own pension benefit, and and then they also deal federally with something called the Old Age Security, which is more based on residency as opposed to whether you worked or not. The residency requirements get full of it. You have to live in Canada for up to 40 years to get it, and 20 years you can get part of it. And then there's also the employment insurance, the Employment Insurance Act, where they pay out when you're unemployed or when you're on mat leave or paternity leave.
That's one of those oddities, isn't it? Employment insurance, you only get employment insurance when you're not employed.
Yep, exactly. And this is by and both employers and employees pay into that system. And self-employed has a certain type of benefit they could pay into, but for most type of self-employed, it's still not quite set up the way it should be.
That is a big problem, of course, with EI and self-employed, because to a large extent, so essentially the big question becomes one of, you're self-employed, but what happens if your business goes flat? Right? It's not that you're suddenly going to take employment. No, you're actually down on your luck. Business is going through bad times, and you're waiting for business to pick back up again. Because as soon as business picks back up again, you're a millionaire again.
Yep, exactly. And this is one of the things that is it's very complicated. And then there's also the Canada Disability Benefit, which is a new benefit that's been passed recently, and it's still under construction, or destruction, whatever way the disability community wants to look at it. And it's something that we expect to see starting to flow in 2025.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are benefits that are run federally. and governed federally.
About CPP would say that it's the the government's trying to buy the vote of those that might receive it.
Yeah, very limited people will be getting it. I can guarantee you that much.
That's another question entirely. Yeah. That's another question entirely. Okay, another matter is income tax, the dreaded income tax.
Yep.
Yes, they take your friggin' money from you.
Yep, the government of Canada determines your taxation. They have a whole thing called the Income Tax Act. Someday, if you have insomnia, you can borrow my copy of the Income Tax Act.
Oh,
I can put you to sleep.
I think I will give that a pass.
It's a very but what it is, it's a very complex setup. Like provinces do have somewhat a power to tax, but it's done in a different way. The federal government gives up tax points where the province could move in and be able to take.
That actually bothers me, because that's about the redistribution of the tax to the provinces. And what it does bother me that we don't get, for example, we pay, well, one of them net contributors to the federal government, we pay more than we get back, a higher percentage than we get back from many provinces, including Ontario.
Mm-hmm. There is a that's why they call it an equalization. They have something called the Equalization Act too, which gives to various provinces. So if you have a poor province where you're not really able to give as much, then you get more back. So to help. Yeah. And what it's supposed to do is even out services across Canada so that we're getting relatively the same services.
Yeah, there's some positives and negatives with that, but anyway, that's a whole political discussion, not a legal one. Okay, so the next area is for the bad boys out there.
Criminal law. Now this is a really good one. There's a movie called Criminal Law, wasn't it? One time?
I thought it was a TV show.
Yeah, and there is Criminal Intent, different shows, Law and Order, Criminal Intent. But criminal law is governed federally. It tells you what's against the law, what isn't, and what kinds of punishments could be eked out.
And the good thing about it being federal is south of the border, our friends down there, they've got 50 different criminal codes down there, one for each state. And that could be problematic because you might get a life sentence for a crime in one state, and in another state you get 3 years.
Yep. And the problem, and they do have federal criminal code, like mail fraud, wire fraud, different things, that kidnapping, things like that are federal offenses and are governed through their Federal Bureau of FBI. Yeah. So they look after the federal stuff, but
there's a whole heap difference between the American use of criminal law and the Canadian, because we
both have federal systems in terms of our structure of government, but how our federal systems respond and how they are set up are very different. Like in Canada, our federal government is up, and that the devolution down to the provinces, which devolutions down to the municipalities.
Yep. And the question about criminal law, as I understood it, a certain John A. MacDonald actually had been doing some investigations into the US, and when he went to the UK for the original setting up of Canada, the original Confederation, he actually stated to the UK Parliament that actually having criminal code at the federal level would be an absolute must, because the mess they have in America was not something that we wish to get into Canada.
Mm-hmm. It's caused many wars too within the U.S. The Civil War.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that criminal law.
And in fact, actually, when we're talking about criminal law and the differences between the states, I believe it's Roosevelt did a deal in relation to actually the building of the interstate highways in America. He did a deal on, to level out the speeding speed limits for those countries. And he actually did a deal whereby he basically went to the lower speed limit states to actually accept the lower speed limits as opposed to the higher speed limits. Because essentially, if you were in, and don't take my word for this, but say, for example, if you were in Montana, you could drive 90, fine, no tickets. But if you were in Delaware, it was 55 and nothing, not an inch more. That type of thing. So they went to the lowest common denominator to actually instigate that across the thing, and they actually did a deal with many of the states to actually level out the speeding offenses and level out and create the interstate highways at the same time.
Making a part of the interstate.
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing that I found fascinating about that. But as I say, it's very poor thing to go compare Canadian criminal law with American criminal law. Obviously, there are many similarities, like the definition of what a first-degree murder is. There's a lot of similarities, but remember, American law is based upon an extra 100 years of an extra 100 years of independence from the British Empire.
Yeah, and this is where a lot of our criminal law is more based on precedent, where we base a lot of ours on what our British people did. And we try to keep that all across the whole country so that every province, if you shoplift in Manitoba, you get treated the same way in Ontario if you shoplift. Okay, so that's why we have it federally.
Yeah. And the point being is that, okay, so if you shoplift in Manitoba and you run to Ontario, where do you get tried if you get arrested?
Usually in Manitoba.
Yeah. Okay. So in that regard, you'll still go back to Manitoba to
go to another province if they have to drag you back. And the other thing that the federal law does in terms of treaties is there's also something called an extradition treaty. Okay? So people who commit crimes, say in Canada, and decide to leave the country, a lot of countries have an extradition treaty where they will just find you and send you back to Canada to be tried.
Well, yeah, and that's actually, absolutely, and well, aside from anything else, other countries don't want our criminals, and we don't want their criminals either, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We don't like to share criminals.
Yeah, let's move on. Appointment of judges, superior courts, and Supreme Court.
Yeah, in Ontario we have the Superior Court of Justice and the Ontario Court of Justice. Okay, so the Superior Court of Justice is appointed federally, and there's federal courts, the Federal Court and the Federal Court of Appeal, as well as the Supreme Court of Canada, are all federally appointed. Okay, the Ontario Court of Justice is appointed provincially. So these, when you're looking at appointments of judges to these courts, what it is, again, there's a law that sets up how these judges are appointed. An unbiased committee is set up to take applications and recommend people after they vet them. And I think there's some type of screening beforehand just to ask questions if there is any kind of partisanship in the person's past or whatever. And then they appoint them. And they're appointed through the Prime Minister. But the Prime Minister doesn't go out and say, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, I pick you as a judge and you're going to go out. It doesn't go that way. It comes out through recommendations from a nonpartisan committee.
Yeah. All right. And and all of that kind of stuff. Well, there's rules and regulations in relation to that we've had, that essentially you don't get what you will get with America with I want to load my, Trudeau saying, I want to load my Supreme Court with liberals right now. Doesn't happen, does it?
Doesn't happen. The people that get appointed to the Superior Court, there's a couple of people who have been questionable, but most of the time we've had people that were very competent and very capable of delivering well thought out decisions. Okay. And the Supreme Court of Canada, we didn't have the Supreme Court of Canada and oversee the Charter of Rights until 1982.
Yeah.
Okay, so then that's when they started interpreting the Charter.
Yeah, we have Mr. Pierre Trudeau to thank for that, of course,
Yep.
because when he went back to the UK to actually finalize our constitution and get that all, so Canada was totally 100% self-governing, including having a superior court, a Supreme Court, I mean, that was important because the last thing you needed was actually to have the decisions of Canada have to go to the Privy Council, which is essentially the House of Lords, the judicial House of Lords in the UK.
Yeah, and that's what we used to do before.
Yeah.
If you wanted to change the Constitution, we had to go there.
And actually, to a large extent, the Privy Council, in terms of, a lot of the Commonwealth, the Privy Council has never really wanted to become the kind of last line of judicial decision making. They wanted that to have been divested a long time ago, particularly in the larger of the Commonwealth nations like Australia and
New Zealand,
Australia, Canada, etc. And the whole issue, for example, when India got its independence, they don't go to the Privy Council. They have their own superior court.
Yeah, the High Court.
Yeah.
So they have all of these. Yeah, they have a lot of. They have some differences, but they're also very similar in type of structure when you go across the different common law countries.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's naturally so, of course, because we all operate under the common law rules. Okay. Moving on to something else, of course, which is particularly important to Canada, is Indigenous law. This covers things like the reserves and land rights, particularly for Indigenous people.
Yeah, there's laws or rules that govern, first of all, who is Indigenous, who gets to be given Indigenous rights, and there's certain places where in the reserves, what rights Indigenous communities have. Generally, they elect their own. They run sort of like a municipality. And there are some restrictions that the federal government gives them. And then also to know that there's 70% of the Aboriginal community, they live in cities. They don't live on reserves.
Yeah, I was going to say that has, of course, changed over time because at one point the reserves were kind of the, where most of the Aboriginal, most of our Indigenous people used to live. Now that is becoming, probably 50-50, living in cities, and even many Indigenous people have bought their own homes, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, there has been a lot of changes with that, and I think that there is, like, we also have to look at things because historically, Indigenous people have been abused, disadvantaged, or colonialized, as some people would say. Okay, sent off to residential school, sent off to be raised by white families. They had to give up the use of language, their customs, their culture. So there's a lot of things that have happened, and these things are inscribed in law. It's not like we're giving Indigenous people special rights. We're not. These rights were already inscribed in law, and they're also in our Charter of Rights. Okay, so whenever there's a new program or anything, whether it's provincial program or federal program, Aboriginal groups have the right to say, okay, we would like to run our own program based on this. Okay, or we would like to be consulted so that we could at least have some input so that it is Indigenous friendly. Okay, there's a lot of different things that people think. They're not because they're treated differently, but we're giving them access and some respect because they were the first here. We hear about the land acknowledgements, we hear about all these different things. I think a lot more has to be done, eh? But I think things will gradually move towards that direction.
Yeah, I don't
And
know enough about land. I have to say I don't know enough about land acknowledgements.
yeah, these are things where, like,
I know
we've
what they
populated
are,
these lands that have actually been originally occupied and farmed, tendered, and cared for by the indigenous groups.
but I know what they are. I just don't know. I wouldn't be able to, in any area of the country, I wouldn't be able to know that, hey, these people are, are the indigenous group,
Yeah, yeah. And this is something that people have been starting to do, like at the beginning of city council meetings, at beginning of school board meetings.
Oh, yeah.
Some meetings that I attend, they have land acknowledgement rights at the beginning. And these things are very important. And we even have a special court for people to go through if they have been convicted of a crime. It goes through the sentencing procedure where there's what they call the Gladue principle,
Yep.
where indigenous people would be considered and their background as an indigenous person would be considered in terms of what kind of sentence they should have, or if they should be serving time in any kind of facility, what kind of facility they should be serving in time. Right? It's a very different process. Once you attend one, it's very interesting.
I did, yeah, I did see, there's some interesting questions about those that are actually different, that we have to take different consideration in. Okay, so let's move on to another area, from native to treaties and international law, because
Yep.
trade, it discovers things like trade, extradition, copyright, patents. And as I said before, copyright and patents are a thing of international law, right? They came through that path, and essentially most nations that have them have followed those original copyright treaties. And
And family law enforcement is also part of that. If you owe child support, there's agreements with different countries too, with Canada. And they can chase you if you got to run to one of those countries and you're trying to avoid payment for child support.
Okay, there's potential is that you could still avoid some of those child support issues if you go to certain countries, right?
Yeah, but I think it's starting to get more. Yeah,
And
these are things where global agreements get formed, and this is how we start doing it because we're part of a global community. It doesn't mean that the global community determines what our laws are, but it goes the other way around, where we work with other people in the global community so that we can enforce our own laws.
Yeah.
Okay? So it gives us that added protection of our independence and our sovereignty.
Yeah. Okay.
And then at the same time, we're respecting their sovereignty too, to enforce.
And one of the important aspects about trade laws is that's how we can sort out, that's how we can figure out some way to actually trade products with Japan or Kenya or South Africa or Russia or, God forbid, or anything else to that nature. We can come up with international treaties between two nations. Most international treaties are between two nations. Some international treaties are between multiple nations.
Like CETA, NAFTA, others. And then we're looking at a Pacific Rim. I think there was another trade agreement that was set up.
There's a Central African trading treaty as well, rather like the EU. We're not as well developed as the European Union.
And then when you're in the EU, that whole European Union is actually intertrading. They trade with each other.
Okay? Well, that's the basis, of course, of the Treaty of Rome. The Treaty of Rome was originally set up as an iron, steel, and coal treaty. Iron and coal treaty, basically, and other things.
And at any time, like Germany is still Germany, has its own sovereignty. France is France and has its own sovereignty. The UK used to when it was part of the European Union. had its own sovereignty. So did some of the other places. They had their own sovereignty. So, but they still participated in the trade.
Yeah, and obviously in some nations, for example, if we're talking
UK will
steel,
have to go back into trading with the European Union.
And for example, if you're talking about steel, might be some nations that don't produce steel.
Yeah, they just don't have the resources.
They still benefited from those international treaties. Anyway, moving on to other things in relation to Canada and the federal aspect of this, we're then talking about the big number one, citizenship.
Citizenship. Okay, who can come to Canada? You know, and under what circumstances?
Yeah, immigration.
That's determined federally.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, like, for example, like want to come to Canada, but should I invite my all my cousins, my mother, my father, and their parents, their cousins, and everybody else? Should I bring all 500 family members over? Okay, is that acceptable? No. There's rules around that about who you can bring over and how they get supported when they're in this country. Contrary to what people believe, we just don't give refugees $6,000 a month to live on. Okay? I've never heard of any such thing. Actually, they're given the equivalent of welfare for up to a year, okay, for their family size. That's it, and they get some kind of setup allowance, about $3,000 or $4,000 to buy furniture and pay person last month's rent or whatever it is they have to do. I mean, these things are not like, we don't open our doors wide to refugees, and in many cases, in fact, most cases, these people are sponsored by somebody else, either by family members or community associations are sponsored. And because, and if the sponsorship breaks down, guess who's responsible if that family member ends up having to go on welfare?
Yeah, if you
the person who sponsors, they have to pay the government back.
Yeah, if you bring in your family from, from Moldova, right? Just to pick up on one strange or odd European country that everybody picks upon. So you bring in your family from Moldova, and they suddenly now are on unemployment. You're responsible.
Yep, and this is where you do it, and there's because this is a very responsible thing. So the first thing they'll do, and eventually they will apply for, like, you go on a work visa, and sometimes you want to stay, and I said, well, I'd like to stay in Canada. Okay, so your work visa is limited, it's time limited, but you go to different places, usually within a particular field that you're in, where jobs are needed, and they come in. Yeah. And then sometimes you say, well, I like Canada, I'd like to stay here. So you would apply for permanent residency, and it takes a little bit of time to apply for permanent residency. There's qualifications for that.
Oh, yeah.
To become that. You can't be just somebody who says, well, I'm going to become a permanent resident, and you're a serial killer back in your own country. You can't do that.
You aren't going to make it.
They'll find out about it, believe me, and they check your background. Okay? And then there's other people who come to this country who are economic immigrants, who come in, who, oh yes, look, somebody's waving their hand because they had specialized skills. IT, law, medical. Now they're looking for nurses, doctors, people like that. It doesn't mean they actually get to practice their skills. They come down here and they drive cabs.
Yeah, you've joked about the cab driver immigration program.
Oh yes, the cab driver immigration program. And many people have gone through that.
Yep. Let's move on to another point.
Okay.
So, federal government regulates food manufacture labeling, and they also regulate the pharmaceutical industries. So they set standards. They, when they say regulate, it's not that they're getting in the way and saying thou shalt not do this. They're basically setting the standards and actually inspecting where necessary.
Yep, exactly. Like, I want to introduce a new drug that this is going to help millions of diabetics. Okay, so this drug has to be tested, has to be peer reviewed. There's a whole lot of things that have to be done and researched. Okay? And then they go through different steps, and before the drug is able to enter the market, they want to say, first of all, A, that the drug is effective, more effective than a placebo. B, that the drug is also safe. Okay, safe doesn't mean it has no side effects. Every drug you take has a side effect. but they want to make sure that most people who use a drug will find it benefits
Well,
you a lot more than it would harm you.
And food manufacturing and retailing, that's an important thing because that governs how we, how we process foodstuffs like meats, and like vegetables, like fish, all of those sort of things have to be done to particular standards, and those standards and the labeling and for example, it's the labeling governs how you've got to be precise about how the measurements are, and what the cost will be.
Yeah.
And the cost has to be associated with the weight, and that's particularly important when you're dealing with prepackaged food like meat, like chops and uh, and fish, meat, etc. All of those sort of things prepackaged, they have to be done to a particular standard. So the meat that you buy can't be $20 a kilo when the meat I'd buy is $2 a kilo. If it comes from the same source, it has to have the same basic rules.
Same standards, and also have to make sure that what you're eating is actually the meat you think you're eating.
Exactly. Yeah. And
there's a lot of people who think, well, this is stuff like sometimes you get all these plant-based, but they tell you how it's delivered. They have ingredients.
Yeah.
They have to publish ingredients. They have to publish certain ingredients as well, like sugar, salt, calories, different things like that. Hey, what size is a serving size? Things like that they need to regulate. This is all regulated. Okay? And the people who provide that. And also how this the meat is created, like how you treat your animals. Okay? Before we send them through the slaughterhouse and we do that. That's also regulated.
And if you think about it, food and pharmaceutical regulation is something that happens pretty well in every country across the planet.
Yep, they all have their regulations.
From the poorest to the richest. Yeah, from the poorest to the richest, they all have regulations involved in it.
Yep, and they have to. They have to, because you can't be going out giving drugs to people that you don't know what they're going to do to them.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
And food. Like there's a lot of food now that's being where the animals are fed antibiotics.
Yep.
Right? And this is something that a lot of people are protesting against, and that there needs to be some kind of labeling involved so that people know that they were not raised with antibiotics or that they were grass-fed, that sort of thing. And there has to be some way that they can track that back and prove it. So that you can't just put a label on it and say, oh, this is grass-fed, this is organic, when in fact, maybe it isn't, so there has to be a lot more put into it. So that would be federally governed.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's right that we have those kind of things, because we rely upon those sort of things. You want to ensure that the side of beef you have, there's a particular standard to it, or the piece of salmon you have is a particular standard to it. I'm not going to pretend I even know how you would classify those things, but I trust there are people out there that do.
Yep, there's a lot of different things that they do, and it's a whole system. It's like an industry, and it's a system that involves and takes care of these things.
Okay, we've just covered a lot of federal law, but there's a couple of things here where there's some shared responsibility with provinces, and that includes immigration and settlement. More settlement than immigration, because actually how you get into the country is a federal law, but what you do when you get here and how you're settled is provincially managed. Marriage and divorce, because I think marriage
earlier, because of the splits of the courts.
Yeah,
how
marriage that's been set up and manages across the provinces, and agriculture and old age pensions also have split levels of responsibility.
Yeah, healthcare too, but healthcare is built by a federal government, where it had a federal relationship with the provinces, and they created the Canada Health Act. And all that did with the Canada Health Act is Remember when we said about how some provinces don't make very much money and other provinces give more than they take? So all of that stuff is used to equalize so that we all get the same kind of health care when you go across the country, or the same level of care. Okay? Even though I would argue about quality care, but
and the worst thing is to get off the plane in Nunavut, trip and fall, and you don't get the same health care as you do here in Ontario.
Yeah, exactly. So this is why we have that. So the Canada Health Act, and they also have a right to set standards. Like, if a province is found that they're in breach of the Canada Health Act, there's a number of things that they can do to find themselves in breach, such as billing people directly for some of the care that they get, or topping it up with some kind of extra benefits on top of it. Okay? These things could be problematic, and some people argue this should be something that should be allowed. Other people say no, it should never be allowed. But these are things that the Canada Health Act takes care of. So what the Canada Health Act does, if a province that you're in starts breaching that law, the Canada Health Act takes money from its payment to the provinces for the health care and claws it back. Okay? In exchange to the equal amount of money that's been extra billed or wrongly invoiced to the customer. So these things are, so that's what the Canada Health Act says. And it's also supposed to be accessible and publicly administered, which is starting to take some risk, some hits across the country. And there's a few other things where accessibility and you can't say that Canada has a universal healthcare, but for what we do cover in terms of healthcare, it is universally accepted. Okay? Yeah. But we don't cover everything like dental, podiatry, which I need badly. It's not covered under OHIP. Certain things with eye care, certain types of eye care is not covered.
I think we don't have enough eye and dental care, to be quite honest.
Yeah, dental care is another thing that when Medicare came in, the dentists protested and said they didn't want to be included under healthcare because teeth had nothing to do with health, which it has everything to do with health.
It has everything to do with health.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And the other question was marriage and divorce.
Marriage and divorce. I mean, in a province, you have the Marriage Act. Who can get married and on what conditions you can't get married, and certain things like you can't marry I think it's like you can't marry your brother or your sister or your kid.
Well, that would be odd.
Yeah, you can't, like that, things like that. Or if there's a couple of cases where you can't, and this was taught, and then and then there are some situations where
again marriage act. So, for example, an Ontario Marriage Act would only cover what who can marry who within the province of Ontario. For example, if if people were married in, let's say, Nigeria, and no disrespect to marriage laws in Nigeria, but they breached the Ontario law, Ontario would still recognize those marriage law, that marriage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the thing is, what happens when a marriage breaks down? Then there's separation agreements, domestic contracts are done in Ontario. And then for the final divorce, it's federal.
And the notable thing here is that, as some people will know, I'm an officiant, registered and licensed in Ontario as an officiant, but I can't marry somebody in Quebec, or even stand 1 foot in Quebec and 1 foot in Ontario and marry somebody, because that's not legal. I can only marry people within Ontario.
Yeah, because the Marriage Act is provincial, and you're an official under the Marriage Act. Okay, so you get a license to officiate.
Yeah.
And you get that through various organizations, most often religious, but you don't have to be religious or part of a religious affiliation.
Yeah.
Like Humanists of Canada have provincial organizations that help people get official status. Yeah. So these things are all very.
The rules do differ from province to province.
Yeah, exactly. And then this is one of the things. Like at one time, people of the same gender were not allowed to be married. And that changed, okay? Because we had to fight the federal government, okay? Because that's part of a federal responsibility of marriage. So we had to fight that. And then once that got fought, then all the provinces had to follow suit and change their relatively marriage acts, and they had to allow same genders to marry.
All right. I think that's been a kind of nice wander through federal law. We've not covered everything because it's absolutely impossible to cover everything, but we've given a good flavor there. And this today's show, Spin Legal, is brought to you by myself, Peter, and herself, Angela. And we're both partners of Invictus Legal LLP. And if you need any legal advice, you can always come to us because we'll answer your questions. And today was all about the use of federal law in Ontario. Sorry, federal law in Canada. Sorry. And Angela, I'll leave the last slide to you.
Yep. And none of what you heard today or from any of our earlier programs can be construed as legal advice. This is purely information about what is included as federal law. And in our shows, we just talk about legal issues or talk about legal issues that come up in the news, and we discuss them. If you have a specific legal problem that either gets triggered by something we talk about on this show, okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that what we're talking about may apply to you. But if you feel that, hey, I have a question, I think I'm having an issue I want to ask about, go visit your paralegal or your lawyer. We'd like you to visit us, but you can visit anybody, a lawyer or paralegal, who can give you that advice that would apply to you, okay?
Right, and Robert DePaul says thank you for the show. There we go.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Robert. And we'll be back. We'll be back next week, and next week's show is going to be about provincial law. So everything you want to say about Doug Ford, but never had the courage to say, you can say so now.
Yeah,
or Catherine Wynne.
Yeah, there's a page on Facebook called Dog Food. Doug Ford.
Well, I was going to say there's probably as much hate mail out about Catherine Wynne as there is Doug Ford, right?
Yeah, there's always people who hate whoever's in power.
Absolutely.
It's probably the same haters who for Kathleen Wynne are now writing to Doug Ford.
I'll hate Catherine Wynne, and now I'll hate Doug Ford when he comes in because he didn't listen to me.
You know what it is? It's because they're in power.
Yeah.
And they're perceived that they have the rights or the authority to do things, and many times they don't.
Yep, absolutely. We have a misconception, which is one of the reasons why we were talking about the limits on federal law today, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And exactly that whole question about who sets, the governor of the Bank of Canada has independence from the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister can't go around and saying, you're going to put up interest rates next month.
Yeah, you can't do that.
Yeah.
The governor has a board of advisors, and the board of advisors together, they determine these things. And no matter what things with the facts of what's going on in the economy.
And no matter what you might think about what the decisions the governor of the Bank of Canada does, throwing Justin Trudeau out at the next election isn't going to change that.
I know. It's going to be the same thing under anybody else who might come in.
Yeah, exactly.
So keep those torches and pitchforks at home.
But Dave Wheeler just went out and bought his pitchfork today. He assured me.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah,
he was show that to everybody at his next show. At your next show,
he was getting ready for the Red Revolution when the Red Revolution comes. But then again, there'll be free beer for all the workers at that point, won't there?
Oh God, free beer! I need that.
That's what the song said. Haven't you heard that? There'll be free beer for all the workers when the Red Revolution comes. Anyway, no revolution here. We're just talking about federal law, and we're just winding down for the day. Yep. And thank you, everybody, for for being with us, and have a great
Absolutely.
week.
If you have an idea of what you would like us to speak about, just write in the columns, in the column down below in the comment section about some type of topic you would like us to talk about, and we'll certainly put it on our next or maybe some future show, and then we'll put it together.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.